It's something where everything Steve did was filmed. So while it seems kind of bizarre that his accident was filmed, it really wasn't. Everything he did with wildlife was filmed, and this accident was just...
There are moments in a parent's life that arrive without warning. Moments that don't announce themselves with fanfare or preparation. They just hit you square in the chest, and suddenly you're standing in the middle of a crowded room trying to hold yourself together while everything inside you quietly comes undone. For Terri Irwin, one of the most resilient women the world has ever watched carry an impossible weight. That moment came not in a hospital room, not at a graveside, and not during one of the hundreds of painful anniversaries she has quietly endured over the last 2 decades. It came under the glittering lights of a formal event, surrounded by strangers in expensive clothes, when she looked across a room and saw her son, Robert Irwin, and for just a fraction of a second, she almost didn't know who she was looking at. That moment broke her open, not because something had gone wrong, but because everything against every odd had gone impossibly right. To understand why a woman as strong as Terri Irwin would dissolve into tears watching her son walk into a room, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning the world saw on television, with Steve Irwin leaping through the Australian bush and the whole family grinning for the cameras. You have to go back to the quiet, shattered beginning that the world never got a full picture of. The one that started on a September afternoon in 2006 and changed the course of every single life connected to that family forever. September 4th, 2006 is one of those dates that people who lived through it remember with uncomfortable clarity. The news came fast, and it came hard. Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, the man who had somehow convinced the entire planet that wildlife conservation could be thrilling and joyful and larger than life, was gone. He was 44 years old. The cause was a stingray barb to the heart, a freak accident so sudden and so unexpected that the world genuinely struggled to process it. Steve wasn't supposed to die like that. Steve wasn't supposed to die at all. He was the kind of man who felt permanent, like a force of nature rather than a human being. The outpouring of grief was global and immediate. World leaders sent condolences. Fans gathered outside Australia's zoo in their thousands. Television channels ran marathon tributes. Newspapers ran front pages that people kept and framed. The world mourned loudly and publicly, the way it always does when it loses someone it loved without ever really knowing them. But inside the walls of Australia's zoo, inside the private quarters of the Irwin family home, the grief was a completely different creature. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a tribute montage. It was a 2-year-old boy named Robert who was too young to understand why his father wasn't coming home. It was an 8-year-old Bindi who was old enough to understand exactly what had happened and would carry that weight in her eyes for years afterward. And it was Terri, suddenly a widow at 42, standing at the intersection of personal devastation and professional responsibility with no road map and no safety net. People talk about Terri Irwin's strength like it's a personality trait she was simply born with. But strength like hers isn't born, it's built, and it's built through choices made in the darkest possible circumstances. In those first weeks and months after Steve died, Terri made a choice that defined everything that came afterward. She chose to stay. She chose to keep the zoo running. She chose to raise her children in the place their father loved most in the world, surrounded by the animals he gave his life to protect. She chose legacy over comfort, and nobody, not a single person with a clear understanding of what that decision actually cost her, could call that anything other than extraordinary. What most people didn't see, and what never fully made it into any documentary or interview or magazine profile, was the weight of what Terri carried alone in those early years. The operational challenges of running a major wildlife facility without the person who was its beating heart. The financial pressures that come with maintaining a zoo of that scale. The legal complexities that follow a public figure's unexpected death. The relentless media attention that camped outside her gates and dissected every public appearance she made. And underneath all of that, the simplest and most devastating task of all, answering a toddler's questions about where Daddy went and when he was coming back. Robert Irwin grew up in a house full of love, but also full of absence. A specific, irreplaceable absence that shaped him in ways that are still unfolding today. Here's the truth about growing up as Steve Irwin's son that the glossy retrospectives tend to skip over. Robert didn't just inherit a famous name. He inherited an expectation. From a moment he was old enough to appear on camera, the world had already decided who he was supposed to become. He was the sequel. He was the continuation. He was Mini Steve, and that label, however affectionately it was meant, contained within it a quiet and relentless pressure that would have crushed a lesser kid entirely. Imagine being a 10-year-old boy who is still figuring out whether he likes soccer or lizards more, and the entire world has already written your biography. Imagine being 13 and watching compilation videos of your late father on YouTube. Not just because you miss him, but because those videos are the closest thing you have to actually knowing him as a person. Robert was 2 years old when Steve died. 2. The man who the world remembers with such vivid, joyful clarity, the laugh, the energy, the famous crikey, is for Robert largely a collection of archived footage and other people's memories. He grew up learning his own father through a screen, trying to piece together the shape of a man from interviews and documentaries and the stories Terri told him at bedtime. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous and complicated emotional reality, and it lived inside Robert Irwin every single day of his childhood. Terri understood this better than anyone. She watched her son move through the world with the ghost of his father walking permanently beside him, and she made deliberate, careful decisions about how to handle it. She didn't pretend the ghost wasn't there. She didn't try to erase Steve's presence from Robert's life out of some misguided effort to give him a fresh start. But she also didn't allow the ghost to become a cage. She gave Robert permission to grieve and to admire and to be inspired by his father, while simultaneously making absolute sure he understood that his own path was his to choose. This required a kind of parenting wisdom that goes well beyond the ordinary. Terri had to hold two things at once, honoring the father and freeing the son. And she had to do it while managing her own grief, running a global enterprise, and living under the constant scrutiny of a public that had very strong opinions about how the Irwin family should look and behave and feel. The tabloids were not always kind. There were years when the narrative pushed by certain corners of the media was one of slow decline, that the Irwin magic was fading, that Australia's zoo was struggling, that Terri was fighting a losing battle against time and nostalgia. There were whispers that Robert was being pushed too hard, put in front of cameras before he was ready, shaped into a product rather than raised as a child. Those narratives were largely wrong, but they existed, and Terri had to navigate them while keeping her son shielded from the ugliest versions of that speculation. What she was actually doing in private was something far more thoughtful than any tabloid gave her credit for. She was raising a man. Every person who eventually becomes someone significant has a moment, usually quiet and unwitnessed, where they find the thing that belongs to them, the skill or the passion or the perspective that is entirely, undeniably their own. For Robert Irwin, that moment arrived when someone handed him a camera. He was still a young teenager when he first started taking photography seriously, and what happened next genuinely surprised people who had expected him to follow his father's path in a straight, obvious line. Robert didn't become a louder version of Steve. He became something entirely different, an observer, a documentarian of stillness. Someone who understood that the most powerful wildlife moments aren't always the ones where a human being is in the frame at all. His photography was not the work of a famous kid with access to good equipment and interesting subjects. It was the work of someone with a genuinely rare eye. The composition, the patience, the technical understanding of light and timing. These were things that couldn't be borrowed from his father's reputation. They had to be earned in the field, alone, often in the pre-dawn dark, waiting for the world to reveal itself at exactly the right moment. Robert earned them. When he began winning serious recognition in the photography world, something shifted in the public conversation about who Robert Irwin actually was. The Wildlife Photographer of the Year recognition was not a participation trophy handed to a celebrity's child. It was a legitimate achievement judged by people who had no particular reason to be generous with the Irwin name. It meant something, and more importantly, It meant something to Robert in a way that no amount of zoo appearances or television segments had quite managed to provide. It gave him ownership. It gave him a domain that was entirely his. Terri watched this development with a particular kind of relief that only a parent who has been quietly worried for years can fully appreciate. She saw her son stop performing and start creating. She saw him trade the seen for the seeing, and in that transition, she recognized the early architecture of the man he was becoming. The photography wasn't just a hobby or a career pivot. It was Robert finding the language in which he could speak most honestly. Steve Irwin's language was physical and loud and immediate. He communicated through action, through presence, through the full-body enthusiasm of a man who seemed to run on a frequency that most human beings simply didn't have access to. Robert's language was quieter, more meditative, more concerned with what happened in the spaces between the dramatic moments. It was a fundamentally different mode of engaging with the natural world, but the love underneath it, the reverence for animals and ecosystems and wild places, was identical. It was Steve's heart expressed through Robert's eyes, and that combination was something entirely new. The photography was the foundation, but the building that went up on top of it surprised nearly everyone. Because Robert Irwin, the quiet observer behind the camera, turned out to also be something that nobody had quite anticipated, a genuine and compelling television presence in his own right. This became undeniable during the period roughly spanning 2024 and 2025, when Robert's public profile expanded in ways that went well beyond wildlife documentary appearances and zoo events. He stepped into the role of television host with a comfort and a charisma that felt earned rather than manufactured. When he joined the hosting lineup of I'm a Celebrity, "Get me out of here," the skeptics were loud. Could a young man who had grown up largely on nature programs carry the rhythm and the humor and the crowd management required by a major primetime format? The answer, delivered episode after episode, was an unambiguous yes. What viewers responded to wasn't just his looks or his name recognition or the comfortable familiarity of his father's legacy. They responded to something more specific and more valuable, the sense that Robert Irwin was genuinely, unself-consciously himself on camera. He wasn't playing a character. He wasn't performing a tribute to Steve. He was simply a young man who had grown up in front of cameras and had somehow, against considerable odds, managed to remain a real human being throughout the process. That is rarer than it sounds. The entertainment industry is extraordinarily effective at hollowing people out, at replacing genuine personality with polished presentation, at taking someone who started as a real person and gradually substituting a version of them that is easier to market and more comfortable to consume. Robert, to the evident relief of everyone who cared about him, had not been hollowed out. He came through the machinery of fame with his character intact, and audiences could feel the difference. The Dancing with the Stars experience in late 2025 added another layer to the public's understanding of who Robert Irwin had become. Watching him commit fully to something so far outside his comfort zone, learning choreography, performing in front of live audiences, being vulnerable in a format that has no safety net of wildlife expertise to fall back on, was revelatory. He won, which was gratifying. But more important than the trophy was what the journey demonstrated, that Robert Irwin was not afraid of being seen as a work in progress. He was willing to be imperfect in public, to learn visibly, to fail gracefully, and try again. That quality, perhaps more than any other, is the mark of someone who has been raised with real emotional security. To tell Robert's story without fully examining Terri's role in it would be to tell half a story. Actually, it would be to tell less than half. Because the transformation the world has been watching in Robert Irwin over the last several years is not self-generated. It is the product of one of the most sustained and extraordinary acts of devoted, strategic, loving parenthood that the public eye has witnessed in recent memory. Terri Irwin did not simply keep her family together after Steve died. She rebuilt it deliberately and thoughtfully into something that could survive and eventually flourish without its original center of gravity. That required her to become simultaneously a grieving widow, a functioning single parent, a business executive, a public spokesperson, a media manager, and an emotional educator. She had to fill roles that a single human being was never designed to fill simultaneously, and she had to do it without the luxury of a private breakdown, because the cameras were always somewhere nearby and the world was always watching and forming opinions. What most people missed, because most people were watching the surface, was the sophistication of Terri's approach to raising her son in the context of such extreme circumstances. She didn't try to replace Steve. She didn't pretend he wasn't gone. She didn't build a shrine and expect Robert to worship at it. What she did was far more nuanced. She kept Steve present as a spirit and a set of values, while making absolutely clear that Robert's job was not to replicate the man, but to find his own way of honoring what the man stood for. There is a significant difference between those two things, and it is a difference that many families in analogous situations get wrong. The pressure to become a lost parent, to serve as their living continuation, can be psychologically devastating. It removes the child's permission to be themselves. It turns grief into obligation. Terri instinctively understood this danger and steered her son away from it with the quiet precision of someone who had thought very deeply about what Robert actually needed, as opposed to what the public wanted him to be. She also gave him something that is genuinely underestimated in its importance: the space to be ordinary. Within the extraordinary context of Australia's zoo and global wildlife conservation and a famous surname, Terri made room for Robert to be boring sometimes, to be uncertain, to be wrong, to change his mind, to develop interests that had nothing to do with crocodiles or cameras or conservation. She treated his personhood as more important than his brand, and that prioritization, sustained consistently over nearly 2 decades, is the reason he is the man he is today. The public version of Terri and Robert's relationship is warm and occasionally emotional and consistently supportive. The private version is reportedly something considerably deeper and more complex than what makes it onto Instagram or into magazine interviews. According to people close to the family, the dynamic between Terri and Robert has evolved over the years from the conventional parent-child structure into something that resembles a genuine partnership, built on shared grief, shared mission, and a degree of mutual understanding that usually takes decades of adult friendship to develop. Robert, by multiple accounts, has been Terri's emotional support as much as she has been his. As he grew older and the roles within the family began naturally to shift, he became the one checking in on her, the one aware of the dates that carry extra weight, the one quietly ensuring that his mother felt seen and valued as a person and not just as the keeper of a legacy. He watched her sacrifice her own social life, her own romantic opportunities, her own personal ambitions for nearly 20 years, and he did not take that sacrifice for granted. That awareness in a young man is not an accident. It is the direct result of being raised by someone honest enough to show their child, gradually and appropriately, the human cost of great love. Their conversations, by all accounts, have never been scripted. Terri has spoken in interviews about the quality of the talks she and Robert have had over the years, the depth of them, the honesty, the willingness to sit with hard emotions rather than paper over them. She didn't raise a son who deflects. She raised a son who faces things. That facing, that willingness to look directly at difficulty rather than away from it, is one of the most consistent traits in Robert's public behavior, and it came directly from the woman who modeled it for him in the hardest possible circumstances. This private bond is ultimately the real transformation story, not the suits and the television hosting and the photography awards. Those are evidence of the transformation. The transformation itself happened in quiet rooms over cups of tea and in long silences driving through the Queensland countryside and in the small daily decision, made over and over again by a mother and her son, to trust each other completely. Which brings us back to the moment. The room full of strangers in expensive clothes. The double doors swinging open. Robert Irwin walking in. If you had been watching Terri Irwin specifically in that moment, which some people were, because Terri Irwin is always worth watching, you would have seen something happen in her face that was unlike the composed, measured expression she typically presents to the world. You would have seen her composure fracture, not in an ugly way, not in a distressing way, but in the particular way that composure fractures when someone is blindsided by something beautiful. Because what she saw when those doors opened was the finished version of a project she had been working on for 20 years. She saw the boy she had protected and shaped and worried over and prayed for, standing in a room full of accomplished adults. And he was not intimidated, not performing, not pretending. He was simply present, utterly himself, and the room was responding to him the way rooms respond to people who have found their own gravity. The tears were not about sadness. Let that be clear. The tears were about the particular emotion that has no clean English name, the feeling of seeing something you hoped for so fiercely and for so long that you had almost stopped letting yourself hope for it, and then watching it arrive anyway. They were the tears of a woman who had made a 20-year bet on a 2-year-old boy and was watching the bet pay off in front of her eyes. They were also almost certainly tears that carried Steve in them. Because Robert standing in that ballroom was the answer to a question Steve would have asked if he had been given the chance. Would his son be okay? And the answer, written clearly in the way Robert moved through that room, was yes. Emphatically, undeniably, beautifully yes. For Terri, that moment was permission. Permission to exhale. Permission to let the vigilance ease just slightly. Permission to acknowledge that the hardest part of her mission, not the business survival or the legacy maintenance, but the raising of a fully realized, psychologically healthy, genuinely good human being under conditions that should have made that impossible, was complete. What Robert Irwin represents in 2026 is something genuinely unusual in the landscape of celebrity and inherited fame. He represents the possibility of a good outcome. In a world that has seen so many children of famous people buckle under the pressure of expectation and scrutiny and grief and public narrative, Robert stands as evidence that it doesn't have to go that way. That with the right guidance and the right values and enough love applied consistently over enough time, a child can walk through the fire of that kind of childhood and come out the other side not just intact, but genuinely remarkable. He is not his father. He will never be his father. And he would be the first to tell you that he has no interest in being his father. Steve Irwin was a singular human being whose specific combination of courage and humor and passion and physical energy will not be replicated, and it would be a mistake and a disservice to Robert to ask it to be. What Robert is himself, a young man shaped by loss and love in equal measure, a photographer who understands stillness, a conservationist who inherited the mission but found his own method, a son who became a partner, a boy who became a man, right there in front of us, while we were all watching for something else entirely. And somewhere in that ballroom, watching all unfold under the lights, Terri Irwin stood with tears on her face and knew that every hard morning, every impossible decision, every year of carrying what should not have been one person's burden to carry, had been worth it. Every single day of it. She didn't just survive the tragedy of losing Steve. She walked through it, and she brought her son through it with her. And now he stands on the other side as living proof that love, applied with consistency and wisdom and extraordinary personal sacrifice, is still the most powerful force in the world. That is the real transformation. That is the story underneath the story. And it belongs entirely to them.